morning, Polyphony and guest. Glad to have you this morning for this next Polyphony session that we have here in 2025. I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Michael Huerter, author of the book, The Hybrid Congregation, A Practical Theology of Worship for an Online Era, which is set for release next month on June the 10th. And Dr. Michael Huerter serves as pastor of worship and engagement at Holmeswood Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri, where he leads worship and fosters community and connection. He earned his Ph.D. in church music from Baylor University in 2023, following an M.Div from Truett Seminary and a Master of Music in Church Music from Baylor in 2019. A lifelong church musician and digital native, Michael is passionate about bridging the gap between academic research and practical ministry. The hybrid congregation contributes to this scholarship and offers a groundbreaking exploration of how worship practices are evolving in the digital age and will be for years, decades to come. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's good to have you.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So to begin, could you share the background and inspiration behind the book? I think we all can imagine, since we've all 5 years later, post-pandemic, can probably imagine how this got started, but we want to hear from you and your story of how this all began.
Yeah. So my interest in digital media and church music actually came a bit before we knew about COVID-19 being on the horizon. So while I was at Baylor pursuing my master's degrees, I was researching ways that church music intersected with digital media and the ways that digital media were becoming more and more ubiquitous in our world. So I was fascinated by these questions of how people and communities were making meaning and forming connection, and how these activities were impacted and changed by cultural and technological changes going on in the world. So I wanted to broaden and deepen this research by continuing with a PhD and writing a dissertation. I was actually going through the application process at Baylor for the PhD in early 2020, and this was right at the beginning of COVID, and my interview with the faculty had to be held over Zoom due to the lockdown early on. So it was kind of surreal to be proposing research that already interested me as all of this, tragedy and chaos of the pandemic was going on, and was really making clear that these questions would likely be important for the future of the church. So that's kind of how I got into it. But back then, of course, we didn't know what the scope of the pandemic's impact on the church might be. We didn't know how long this was going to last, what it was going to be like, or how we were going to find a way forward. So as I was taking these classes and researching theology and philosophy around church music, we were all experiencing a major disruption of how we were accustomed to doing church. And there were so many people who were engaged in conversations around what to do in response to the pandemic, or what worship could look like or should look like, and what place online technologies could have within that, if we could use them, to what extent should we avoid them. And in the midst of all this, I started noticing a bunch of common themes that came up over and over in articles and discussions happening in this time. So there were a few things that started to become clearer to me that then kind of gave me the motivation and the direction to take the research. I think the first thing that I noticed was just church leaders, all of us were struggling to lead in the face of all this change that had happened so suddenly. So for many of us, including myself, the early days of the pandemic were a really stressful and challenging season of ministry. Most churches and pastors didn't have the tools and experience to manage all of this at first. We weren't taught in seminary, how to move your entire ministry online within a week's notice. Like, this was unprecedented for all of us. And also our theological language and our concepts were falling short in some ways as we were grappling with these new realities. And some of the complexity and nuance that we need for pastoral leadership and worship were lost in these knee-jerk responses or sound bites that were either embracing online media, whether it was reluctantly or not, or saying that online expressions of church community were inferior or illegitimate or, not good things that we should be pursuing. I saw concepts and terms like embodiment and virtual and passive engagement or mediation, these terms being used frequently and thrown around a lot, but it seemed like these conversations, many of them were skimming the surface and maybe producing more heat than light. So that was the first thing, that there was all this change going on, and it felt like we needed some more reflection and tools to make sense of what was happening around us. And second, while the COVID pandemic was certainly significant, these questions and issues were broader than just about the COVID pandemic. And this was partly a little clearer to me because I had already been researching digital mediatization and worship for a few years at that point. But it seemed clear that the issues we were facing during the pandemic lockdown were not only caused by the virus, but they were accelerated by it. We'd already been living in kind of the early stages of this technological revolution. I would say it's a technological revolution as momentous as the printing press. The printing press reshaped religious and political institutions, you know, several hundred years ago. And with the internet, with social media, with, all these digital technologies coming through in the past several decades, I would argue that we're in the middle of, not even the middle, the beginning of another technological revolution that will take time to work itself out, take time for us to understand what is going on and how to best move forward. So as we're in the early stages of this technological revolution, online church during COVID is worth reflecting on theologically, but also the church needed more than just that. We needed more than a COVID book. We also needed to attend to the deeper questions that were looming for the future of the church. As our whole world is continuing to shift due to the impacts of these new technologies, what might this mean for the church's witness and the church's worship? I think in some ways, the church may need to adapt or die, but in other ways, the church may need to hold fast to truths or values that are unchanging over time. And that discernment of where we need to shift and where we need to plant our roots firmly, I think is really important. So I think that's kind of the background and the motivation for me behind the book, was coming out of this research I'd already been doing, entering into a Ph.D. in this really pivotal time where there was so much change happening, and trying to make sense of it in a way that was helpful to me in my ministry and could hopefully be helpful to other practitioners as well.
You just saying that latter part, Michael, thank you for sharing, um, giving us that glimpse into how this all came about. And you sharing that last bit reminds me, a year ago, almost to the day, we had Todd Ferguson in this kind of session gathering here. He's at Rice in Houston, teaches there. He's a sociologist, and he did research on the church and various things. But one of the points that came out is, he said maybe churches need to die in order for something else to be resurrected. So that just came to me when what you said. It just took me back to a year ago with Todd Ferguson saying something similar. What were the primary goals of your research that led to your dissertation and ultimately this book?
Yeah, so my main goals as a researcher more generally are to pay attention to the intersection of church ministry and scholarship. I want research that I do to be closely tied to practical and pastoral concerns. So whatever topic I'm researching, I want to bring a practitioner's perspective, and I hope to write and present and share it in a way that can be useful to other practitioners. I think part of that broader goal is I would love to see the church and the academy working together, each seeing the other as an ally that can be supported and valued, not an enemy that is dangerous or misguided. I
Mhm.
think I think back to the times when I was first going into college to study theology and ministry. And I remember people from well-meaning people from my childhood church telling me, be careful, they're going to try to take your faith from you,
Mhm.
which was not my experience. Instead, I experienced a broadening and deepening of faith by being introduced to higher education and pursuing that study. So I think there's always been a tug for me when it comes to scholarship and church ministry, given that I'm involved in both. I love them both and I want them to love each other. So I think there's that motivation underlying what I'm doing here. But then I think more particularly for the dissertation and then for this book, there were two other primary goals. And first, I wanted to provide tools for ministers and practitioners to reflect on their ministry and be able to find something useful for them. I wanted church leaders to have resources to understand our current technological and cultural moment in a broader context. I wanted to give language and share perspectives from multiple fields of research that I feel are valuable as we're navigating this changing world. I believe the church has opportunities and responsibilities in the midst of this change to discern how best to love our neighbors, to build flourishing communities, and seek justice. So, one of those big hopes for me is that this book gives ministers inspiration to do these things that have always been the call of the church and always will be in creative and life-giving ways in a new situation. And then I think second, another goal was I wanted to invite scholars and academics and writers into further conversation about the church and worship and music and technology. It's this is not always true, but it's been a little bit of a frustration of mine when it feels like scholarship around theology or scholarship around church music lags behind other fields when it comes to engaging with new ideas, new technologies, new developments. And I would rather us move forward a little bit to engage with those things proactively than be lagging 10 or 20 years behind other fields. So, not that I'm saying this book solves that at all, but I wanted to attempt to step in and engage proactively from the front of this. So, I'm hoping that this book is a valuable contribution to the Academy and the church, but I'm not under any delusions that it is the final say on any of the topics that I address. As I'm implied earlier, I think we're in the beginning decades of a transition in church and society that's caused by these developments in technological advancement that we may still be adjusting to a century from now. It might be until, 2150 that we can look back and say, and trace clearly, here's what was going on here and the impacts of it all. But that doesn't mean we fold our hands and say, well, this is all too much. I can't bother to engage with this. I think we have a responsibility to try to think deeply and critically about these things and in conversation with one another. I believe that research in both physical sciences and social sciences is really important at this time. So I hope that people in academics can respond to my book and all the other scholarship that's happening around this time by doing more research that goes deeper and further than I could. So yeah, I think I want to provide support and tools to ministers and invite and inspire conversation for academics.
Michael, having read the book in preparing for this interview, it was very apparent um, to me that your love for the church and the academy and your desire to bridge them. And there were points in the book where I would have to reread sections um, because it was so much to chew on. It was all good, but it wasn't. It was going beyond the practical into philosophical, theological, and but um, it it was apparent in reading that you want to bridge these two groups, and it is also a practical, it it encourages us to how we do our practice of ministry. So, in my humble opinion, I think you are on the right track with this book and appreciate your leadership and scholarship already. You're very humble to say that you don't expect this book to be the end all be all to answering all the questions, but it is a good way to start engaging in conversation in the larger conversation. So thank you for that. This question may be, well, I want to ask you how you envision the book serving both the church music scholars and the practitioners, like particularly pastoral musicians, like many of us here today in this room, so to speak. And just as importantly, can you clarify what the book is not intended to be or do? Just to clarify that, um, that may help set some helpful expectations for those looking to engage with this
Yeah,
practically.
yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think my hope for the book is that it can be useful in providing space to be curious and to think creatively about ministry and worship in an online era. So I've mentioned the cultural shifts that we're experiencing due to technology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I think all of our churches have likely experienced change and loss and new beginnings in the past 5 years. And this is hard. This is hard to navigate as a pastor. It's hard to navigate as a congregant. But it's also an opportunity for us to learn and to grow. So in, the midst of sweeping changes of the demographics of the church, what the role of religion in society is, and uncertainty about the future of our local congregations and the global church, I think it's an important time for us to reflect on what is important to us and what we are becoming, what we want to become also. So in pursuit of that goal, the book includes kind of four large approaches or sections. So I wrote the book about some of the history that brought us to the point that we're in now with the church's relationship to technology, a little bit about the history of earlier communications technologies, but mostly about the recent history of the internet to try to put that in some context. Because I think looking where we have been in the past helps us to see more clearly where we are in the present, and that can inform the decisions we make as we move toward the future. So I think that historical part is important. It's not a huge section of the book, but I think it's important there. And then second, I also wrote about four categories or concepts that I believe are important to conversations around worship and technology. Um, and we may dig into these a little bit more later, but they're concepts that are often presented in binary terms, thinking of something as being active or passive, or embodied versus disembodied, or mediated versus unmediated, and virtual versus real. And in those, early couple years of COVID and in conversations about online church, I saw these concepts coming up time and time again. So I think each of these is important to understanding and making pastoral decisions about ministry in the age of the internet. But it is tempting to default to binary either or thinking. But I think reality is often more complicated than that. So it calls for some more nuance and reflection. So that was the second major goal of the book. And then the third, I looked at the idea of online and offline realities and spend some time exploring how they're often combined in our lives. So rather than living in only one or the other sphere, we spend a lot of our time in both of them overlapping. So I talk about this in terms of hybridity. That's drawing on the work of some scholars like Dr. Angela Gorel. And then, so rethinking church music in a hybrid world of online and offline together gives opportunities to reflect on what the purposes and values of music and worship are and how they might show up in different ways and different combinations in our churches. And then fourth, I researched several online communities that I believe have used digital media to good effect in sharing meaningful rituals, in forming individuals in terms of their character and their behavior and responses to the world, and also in building community and connection. So I hope that these examples, while they're not church groups necessarily, can spark ideas for ministers to consider in their own church contexts. So that kind of leads me into what the book is not. It is not about providing 10 easy tips to build a successful online ministry. It's not about giving shortcuts or tricks or a one-size-fits-all approach. So my goal is not to prescribe how online or a hybrid worship should be done for all churches, but my goal is to expose readers to theological concepts, historical context, real-world examples, and hopefully some helpful language to from a variety of disciplines to equip churches to be more informed and prepared for discernment. What I would love for people to take away from this book, one thing is for them to have concepts and ideas they can take back, can look at their own context, their own church, and ask, what would make sense for us to do here? What are opportunities we can embrace that fit who we are, fit our resources, fit the challenges that we're facing? So that's kind of the goal, but to do that with a broader, kind of open-eyed view of what may be happening more broadly. I also want to mention this book does not deal directly with artificial intelligence. There's some interesting scholarship coming out about AI and worship music and AI in the church more broadly, but that's not the focus of this research. I hope to learn more about that in the future. But I think that does highlight how rapid technological advancement and change has been happening. So I started this research back in 2020, finished the dissertation in 2023, and in the time it has taken to move the book from dissertation to published work, this new technology has risen up that, has huge implications for large parts of society, from education to economics. And so there may be, in a few years, it's possible there may be a couple details of my book that feel a little bit dated, but the goal was to write about broader principles and larger scope things that are happening in order to provide tools that can hopefully stand the test of time for years ahead. So I'm hopeful that even though this does highlight the rapid change and growth of technology, that these principles can have some staying power and can be worthwhile to consider even further down the road.
Hmm. So let's talk about digital media in the church specifically. What are some common misconceptions you've encountered, both from clergy and laity, about digital ministry? And then the second part of the question, how does your book seek to challenge or correct those misunderstandings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the big one for me is the belief that digital media and these technologies are entirely different from other technologies that came before them. And part of one of the ideas that I explore in the book is that when technologies are new to us, we're very aware of them, and they seem, very strange, maybe even threatening. So we're concerned that new technologies may cause harm or destabilize our societies or undermine our relationships or our churches. But there have been numerous technologies before digital media and the internet that have impacted human societies and the church in profound ways. And there's often a kind of a kids these days kind of attitude when it comes to technology, and that's perennial. That comes, with every way. Before it was TikTok, it was portable CD or cassette players. Before it was Walkmans, it was young people walking around with their noses stuck in books, and that was, the hobby of the young to throw shade at, as it were. Even looking at prior technologies like the printing press, like the radio, like the television, each of these things brought about kind of this initial response of anxiety and lots of questions about what does this mean for us as churches? What does this mean for what ministry looks like? What does this mean for music and how people will make and share music? How does the economics of all this work out, and how might that form or malform us? And even a millennia or a few millennia before the printing press, Plato worried that if people learned written language, it would undermine and degrade their human capacity for debate and reason. That writing things down was actually a crutch that would make people weaker in terms of their thought. And that seems very strange and ridiculous to us now because written language is so prolific. It is involved in everything we do. We would never think of saying, well, let's make sure we have a church service with no written text. That would be such a strange thought. But we may want to say something like, well, should we really use technology? And by that, we probably mean the most recent technologies, because written language is also a technology. Should we use these things in our worship services? So I think it's helpful to put conversations around the newest technologies around digital media and the social internet in context of this broader history of technology and recognizing that various technologies have always been involved in our worship. And it's a question of how do we use these things faithfully? What are the impacts of them, and how can we use them for good and avoid the negative impacts of them? So I think that's one of those misconceptions that digital media and technologies are entirely different and kind of divorced from all technologies that came before them. They're not. They're just the new thing this decade, this century. And then I think another misconception related to that, I think comes down a little bit to individual personalities or temperaments. I think some of us may be inclined to view the change of new technologies as a threat, and others may tend to see it as an opportunity. I think the reality is somewhere in the middle. There's some of both going on all the time. So I think a similar temptation for churches is to want to just go back to normal. And I think that was, a pretty recurrent feeling. It was a feeling for me as well during those early times of COVID of like, wow, this is chaotic, this is hard, this feels, really uncomfortable, and we just want things to get back to normal. Um, but I think what this misses is that our habitual ways of doing things aren't already perfect. Back to normal doesn't mean we're doing everything correctly. It just means it's what we're comfortable with. And change, such as that brought about by technology or by the pandemic, can invite us to reflect on the way we've always done things and realize we can do them better. So I think that's one thing. I think these past few years have been a wake-up call for the church in a variety of ways, and technology and the pandemic have been part of that. So I don't think we can or should live in a constant state of emergency without any stability, but I also think we'd be missing an opportunity if we just stick our heads back in the sand and, don't engage or reflect further after such, a momentous change like the things that we've experienced. Because digital media aren't going away. And neither is church that includes relationships both offline and online. I think those things are here to stay. It's a question of how do we do them well? How do we do them in becoming more Christ-like? So I think that's a second misconception of like the goal of going back to normal. If that is a misconception, I would also say that the goal of going viral on the internet is also a misconception. And that phrase feels a little strange to talk about now post a COVID pandemic, when I think there is a temptation to view success in online ministry as, reaching millions of viewers or imitating a mega church ministry in our production value, those kinds of things. But I don't think that's what local congregations need to be doing. I don't think that's necessary or necessarily even helpful for doing good hybrid ministry for a local church. There may still be ways to use digital media technology in creative and positive ways that fit well for your congregation, but getting social media followers is not the same as following Jesus. And they're not mutually exclusive. That's not to say that reaching people doesn't matter. It does, but one of them is the main thing, and the social media piece is not necessarily the main thing. So I think those are the misconceptions that I would want to highlight: the placing new digital technologies in the broader spectrum of technologies across history, the temptation to want to go back to normal, and then the temptation to think, well, if we're going to do online, then we need to be like this, multi-million dollar budget online ministry or radio or TV broadcast that has this high production value. I don't think that's necessarily the way to go.
Yeah. Um, Thank you for really explaining, getting into that question. I asked that large question because I knew that that way just addressing a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings. So thank you for that. What are some key takeaways you hope church leaders will gain from this book? Church leaders will
Mhm.
gain from the book, the key takeaways.
Yeah, I hope that church leaders feel encouraged and empowered to continue serving God and loving their people just with a few more tools in their tool belt. I think that's my goal. I hope they can be reminded of the seriousness of their calling to feed and shepherd their congregations and can understand the unique challenges of this time more deeply. But I also hope that they can experience ministry in this. I think this is a pivotal time in human history, but can experience ministry as an opportunity and an invitation to care for God's people and an occasion and for joy and for meaningful connection, not only fear and uncertainty.
Mm.
So I think at the end of the day, I want church leaders to learn some useful things, continue to be curious to learn more, be reaffirmed that they are the right person to nurture their congregation in this time,
Mm.
and then also be exposed to some resources that can help them to make wise and fruitful decisions in their ministry contexts. I think ministry in uncertain times can feel isolating, but while digital media doesn't solve our need for support and relationships, they can be positive avenues. We're not alone, and we can learn from and help each other. I think, this conversation, the resources Polyphony provides are a good example of that, of using these technologies to create a network of connection and support. So I think leaning into that is something that I hope that people can take away.
Thank you, Michael. That particularly you saying you want to reaffirm people to not give up, not feel overwhelmed and like, oh, I can't do this. I should just hang up the hat and let someone else do this. Yeah. Um, we all can learn something new. It's just a willingness and finding the right people, resources to help us along. Yeah. So, um, as a theologian and an active practitioner that you are in your church and life, how have you engaged your congregation? In all fairness, I know you've not been there long. You've only been there what,
A year. Yeah.
year. So
Mhm.
this isn't entirely fair question in a, but how are you engaging? Are you engaging with some of these ideas, insights from your research, or are you dreaming of ways?
Mhm.
Because just a year, we all know, everyone in this room knows that's nothing. You're just getting to know the people
Mhm.
and the soil, if you will, the land of
Mhm.
which you're on now. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in my first year at Holmeswood, I've mostly been leaning into what I found in my research about the possibilities of technology for connecting and including people. So it's been less about, broadcasting to reach large audiences and more about finding ways for technology to include and care for people whose involvement in church might be more limited otherwise. So as one example, there's an elderly couple in my congregation who are members and who attend church basically exclusively online due to health conditions that keep them mostly homebound most of the time. So it's been transformative for me as a minister and also encouraging to this couple and to the congregation to treat them as genuine members of the church and participants in our worship. So in worship planning, this might look like asking, how will people who are worshiping online experience this element of a service? Or are there ways that we can make space for them to participate more fully? In pastoral care, this can mean visitation or emails or phone calls that can build up a connection. Building on that connection, people already feel to a church that they care about and are a part of. It's looked like visiting parishioners to record videos for testimonies or liturgical elements. There's nothing that says that someone who is worshiping from home cannot lead in worship. They can share their faith story, they can offer a prayer, they can read scripture. These things are very possible, assuming that a church has some degree of integration with digital technology. I know some don't, and many do. So that may look different in different contexts, but I think it's been a shift for me to remember and experience that members of my congregation who mostly worship online don't need to only be thought of as consumers, they can also be worship leaders. And then just getting in that habit has made it easier for me to think about, okay, we have an Ash Wednesday service coming up. What does it look like for people to engage in that if they're not able to be in the church building? Maybe our deacons can go visit people who are homebound and take ashes to them, those kinds of possibilities. So I think it has trying to apply some of these things in my own ministry has just looked like opening up, some space for imagination of what might be possible and seeing primarily starting with what are the realities of this congregation, the people who are here, and what does caring for and pastoring them look like.
Yeah. It reminds me of something you said in the book. I'm not going to get it word for word,
Neither
obviously,
will I.
but but the idea that about embodiment, that we think, oh, you have to be physically present in the room for it to be real and for there to be a real experience, and you can't have that experience online. But how many people, how how can one simply argue just because you're physically present in the room and sitting in the pew that you're really engaged, that you're more engaged than the person sitting at home? Is that real? That's not a fair argument. You can't, that that someone sitting at home can be just as engaged. It's different,
Sure.
but it's not that it's lesser or not have, that it's not real, because it is. And how you dive into that in the book, speaking of those dichotomy, that particular dichotomy was just resonated with me a lot. Yeah. and and also how you also thought about how do we include others who are present in the room, that we have those who have physical disabilities, that challenges that we've said, oh, well, we won't bother you with leading in worship. But no, how can they be involved and participate and lead? Yeah. um uh, Before I ask one of my last questions, there's a question in the group chat, I think, um, from Ryan Heritage. Um, Ryan, would you like to ask your question? Um,
I can. I just wondered if thinking about creating an online worship ministry. Our churches are built so the infrastructure is we can do everything that we need to here, you know. So do you give any insights for if you're wanting to really expand into this, here are some key things that you're going to want to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to me. So I don't think I directly address the idea of building a worship ministry online first, but that is an interesting thing to think about. So one of the things that I'm arguing in this idea about hybrid congregations, hybrid church, is that our communities do have both of these online and offline elements together. And I think traditionally the church in, the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century has so far been a building first, online later kind of thing of like the online is the maybe an augment to what we're doing in the church building. But some of the online communities that I studied and did digital ethnography on are, primarily online communities that then go on to have a kind of in-person implication or application. They begin online and then they seek each other out to meet in person, or they begin online and then they get involved in advocacy or fundraising or justice work. And so that kind of flow from initial online connection into offline action or community, I think it's very likely that that may be an important avenue for the church in the future. I mean, and I think a little bit we're experiencing this already in terms of, people initially connect with a church in large part through a website, through a social media account. They may, watch a stream to see, do I want to go check this place out? And then they'll go and get connected in person. I think that flow from online to offline being the kind of the new norm is important to consider. So I really like this question about thinking about starting a worshiping community online. That wasn't something that came up in my research initially to say like I didn't have a wonderful example of, here in 2020, here's this really cool online church that started this way and is now flowing outward into something else. Um,
We've got, well, so interesting thing for us is that we've got a retirement community not far from here that has a lot of our church members. So on Sunday mornings, they get together and they watch our service streaming. And there'll be 20 to 30 of them, together. And then we've
yeah,
got a few church members that will go out there. And so when we serve communion, they've got communion ready for them
yes,
to take. It's interesting. I don't think we do a good enough job uh really connecting with our online people, but occasionally I'll get an email or something from someone that I haven't seen, in 3 years, and they've been watching faithfully every Sunday.
yeah.
And so I kind of feel like we're missing them, you know. So I just wonder how we could do that better.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, when I think about these things, I always find myself coming back to the deacons in Acts, where there's, someone brings up a concern. These people are not being ministered to, they're not being cared for as well as they should. And then the apostles put their heads together and come up with a plan. Here's how we can love these people and care for them more fully. And I don't think that process ends. I think it's wonderful to hear about the example that, is already happening with your church. And I hear that openness and curiosity to say, what can we do better? It feels like we could do more. And that may be the case. So I think that's the ongoing process of figuring out what hybrid ministry looks like.
Thank you.
A comment that relates to this conversation right now. And it's from someone's, I don't know the person's exact name, but because it comes up as music minister. How apropos. Yes, we are set to record many of our elder emeriti who are homebound and share their prayers in our live stream and live in worship via screen. It had dawned on us. It had dawned on us. It was a great way to bring them into the fold of worship. Yeah, that's a great idea. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We also here at KBC, like Ryan says, we're not doing there's more we could do, but we do the passing of the peace each week, and we've encouraged people that, like, for those that are absent that they don't recognize or someone they've been meaning to reach out to, send them a text and share the peace of Christ that way in that moment so that they know they're being thought of. So there's that too. I'm just looking, make sure that we haven't overlooked any comments, questions. The thing I'm reminded of when I'm doing this is what Michael says in the book. Just because the person in the pew looks like they're not engaged, they're not singing with you in worship, they're just sitting there, doesn't mean they're not engaged and they're not worshiping. And just because some of you haven't asked questions, or a lot of us, most of us doesn't mean that you aren't engaging right now in this time. Um, so um, there's just a lot of those kind of statements in various statements in Michael's book that resonated with me, but that idea is kind of came to my mind just now too. And Michael, finally, what words of encouragement or advice would you offer to pastoral musicians and their ministry partners who are still learning to navigate this new digital era of worship and community life?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I would come back to the idea of connection and resources. For me, being in a new ministry role this past year has been a fulfilling and a challenging time, and there's been a learning curve. I suspect many of us experience navigating new technologies as something with a learning curve, and there's challenges and there's triumphs with that. But I think those same technologies have also given me opportunities and resources that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Sometimes that has meant hopping on a Zoom call with a group of other music ministers who have been mentors and peers to me. Sometimes that's then getting to watch a friend or a colleague ministering in their own church, or premiering a new composition, or preaching a sermon, or being ordained. I think those online connections then feed into and strengthen the conversations and interactions I have with that person when I then see them the next time. So I think I would encourage all of us to not think of offline or online ministry as opposed to each other. Instead, they're parts of a hybrid whole, and part of the task that's in front of us is to consider how they can enhance each other and build meaningful connections as we worship God together. So there's not a one-size-fits-all formula to this. I don't think we should be measuring ourselves against unrealistic standards, but I do want to invite us to creativity and curiosity and connection and collaboration. Um, I've heard this time, kind of this time in history, described as kind of the infancy stages of the digital era of ministry. And I really like that word infancy. I recently saw a post on social media about the phrase baby steps. And the poster wrote, I always love it when people say baby steps to imply they're being tentative, when actually, baby steps are a great, unbalanced, wholehearted, enthusiastic lurch into the unknown.
Mm,
So I think in this time there is a lot that feels unknown. And as churches and as ministers, we may feel unbalanced or unsteady. But as we lurch forward, let's be wholehearted and let's be enthusiastic. This is when I'm going to pull the know enough Greek to be dangerous card that pastors love to do, and remind us that enthusiasmos meant something like to be inspired by a God. So, yes, let's tackle the unknown future of hybrid ministry, inspired by the God who called us and who still leads us forward. So
mm.
that's what I think I would offer as our encouragement and benediction to go
That's
forth enthusiastically, take big lurching baby steps, and know you're not alone.
Thank you, Michael. That's a beautiful benediction, and I need you to send that to me. And maybe too. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. I had a benediction ready, but that's the winner today. So let us go with God with that. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for your leadership, your scholarship. Um, we're inspired and we're grateful for you and your ministry, and look forward to the continued conversations that we get to have with you through the book and in the days, weeks, years to come, as we are all pushing forward, lurching forward, right, launching. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks to Ryan for helping make this happen. Thanks to Polyphony and Doug and all the others. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see your faces, to connect with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.